thanks very much, MECLA team, for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Dena Jacobs. I'm a director at Infrastructure New South Wales in the Strategy Division. I'm coming to you from Sydney, from Gadigal land, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Our teams recently released a set of principles on decarbonising infrastructure delivery, and that's what my presentation today will focus on. If I could have the next slide, please, Alexi. This work's coming out of the New South Wales State Infrastructure Strategy, which our division released in May. I do not expect you to read all the text on the screen. That's just a sample of the recommendation that this work is coming out of. So recommendation 27 was around decarbonising public infrastructure. And as you can imagine, this is a very broad area. There's already been a lot of great work by government agencies in working towards net zero in their operations. This is something that Ros already alluded to, but there's been a lot less work on embodied emissions. So there was a clear policy gap in this space. Industry have been coming to us and speaking to us about this and asking for action on embodied emissions. They've been asking for greater policy clarity in the space, as well as a mandate and some incentives to act. More broadly, embodied emissions felt like a very natural place for Infrastructure New South Wales to be working. As an organisation, we're very focused on infrastructure decision-making as well as how infrastructure is delivered. So it made a lot of sense for us to start and turn our mind to embodied emissions. If I could have the next slide, please. Despite the fact that most agencies haven't really been focusing on embodied emissions, others have been doing quite a bit of work in this area, and we sought to build on that work in our paper. We weren't really looking to reinvent the wheel, but to bring together the initiatives that already existed in a cohesive way and to plug the gaps in government's approach to embodied emissions to deliver on that clear mandate and action that industry was asking for. What you can see in this slide is some of the key initiatives that exist in this space already. This is in no way an exhaustive list, but just some of the ones that really influenced us, as well as some of the ones that are probably a bit more prominent. The first initiative on the screen there is the State Environmental Planning Policy for Sustainable Buildings. This was released by the New South Wales Department of Planning and requires reporting on embodied carbon for most buildings from next year. And alongside that policy sets the basics calculator, which will give a way for people to measure their embodied emissions. The second initiative on the screen is NABERS' embodied carbon calculator. NABERS is an organisation, an entity that sits within New South Wales government, but it has national reach, and they're developing an embodied emissions calculator, which we piloted from next year. The third initiative on the screen is Transport for New South Wales, a Sustainable Procurement and Infrastructure Initiative. Transport have been very active in this area. They've helped us a lot with developing our principles, and we drew on them quite heavily. And they've engaged with industry very extensively in developing their work and are setting some requirements on sustainability, some of which relate to embodied emissions. We, of course, have MECLA, the good people who brought us here today, and they're driving change by bringing stakeholders together, contributing to research and uplifting capability in the space. There are, of course, organisations like the Green Building Council and Infrastructure Sustainability Council who've been working in this space for a very long time, and they rate projects on their embodied emissions. And more recently, we've had some of the peak bodies coming forward. So Infrastructure Partnerships Australia and the Business Council have released papers on embodied emissions. And they've been calling on government to change the way it makes decisions to better account for embodied emissions. If I could have the next slide, please. So turning to our principles, our discussion paper sets out 6 principles to guide the decarbonisation of infrastructure delivery. The first principle is around the use of consistent methods and data. We want to have some consistency around the scope of embodied emissions and how we calculate them. As Monica alluded to just before, there's a lot of confusion about A1 to 3 to 5, whether you're including end of life periods. So people are coming at this issue from very different perspectives. And a very big challenge in this space is you can give the same project to 2 different consultants and end up with very different estimates of embodied emissions. As you can imagine, this is a big problem for government if you're trying to compare projects. It's also quite a problem when it comes to having confidence in interventions. If you have interventions having varied impacts depending on who's calculating their effect, it's hard to know what you should be pursuing. The second principle is around reducing embodied emissions right from the early stages of a project. This is quite an important one because it's that early stage where you can really influence the shape of a project. Often interventions come at the procurement end of things, but by that stage, the design's locked in and you're really just tinkering at the edges. But if you start thinking about it right up front, when someone comes to you with a need, you can ask, do we even need a whole infrastructure project here? Could we have a technology solution perhaps? Or is there an existing asset we can augment similar to what we saw in Ballarat in the previous presentation? So we really need to be bringing that embodied emissions thinking right up front to the point where we're analysing needs. The third principle is around accounting for embodied emissions in business cases. And this one's about making sure that our decision-making frameworks in government are right. So does cost-benefit analysis include the cost of embodied emissions? We really need it to if it's going to be incentivising people to reduce those emissions. Do business cases require project proponents to detail exactly how they've reduced their embodied emissions? And then do our assurance processes check that project proponents are actively trying to reduce emissions? The fourth and fifth principles that you can see relate to procurement. The fourth asks agencies to set requirements around embodied emissions. And the fifth asks them to actually place weight on how well bidders are reducing their emissions. So for example, under principle 4, an agency would say, I want to see bidders reduce embodied emissions by X% in what they put forward. And under the fifth principle, they would place some weight in their tender evaluation process. That could be something like a pass-fail criterion, where they say, if you haven't actually met that requirement, we're not even considering your bid, through to something that some of the more advanced jurisdictions like the Netherlands are doing, where they've developed indices that combine carbon and price and consider those things jointly. The final principle relates to capability uplift. And a big issue in this space is going to be that capability varies quite significantly across government and industry. Some agencies and larger contractors are really well placed to act in this space and could do so from tomorrow, while others are going to require some support. And so if we want to see the principles become a whole of government policy, we really need to be making sure that we're bringing everyone along the journey. If you could go to the next slide, please. So where are we up to with all this work? We had extensive engagement with agencies ahead of developing the principles, and we published the principles in early October and held an industry forum to get some feedback and generate a conversation around this. We've now arranged a series of roundtables with industry for later this month, where we're going to be seeking more targeted feedback, and we'll be discussing our next steps in the work. And alongside all of that, we've started looking at some of the actions listed in the document. So if you were to pick up the discussion paper, you'd see that under each of the principles are a series of actions. And we're picking away with some of those key actions to be able to enable a policy to be developed. And our work on developing the policy will kick off early next year. That's all I had for today. I'd very much welcome any questions you may have.